AskReddit by Asch. What are some psychology experiments with interesting results? White rats and black rats were raised separately without seeing each other. When a black rat was placed in the white rat's cage, the other rats ostracized him. When white and black rats are raised together and a new black rat is placed in a cage, the white rats accept him. So basically rats are racist, unless raised to accept differences. I wonder about this one. Rats don't like any other rats that are not from their group. If you keep rats as pets, it's a whole big thing to introduce new rats into your old group. I imagine the results would have been similar no matter how they looked. Also, red-eyed rats have pretty shitty eyesight. I'm late, but nobody has said it yet. The self-fulfilling prophecy studies are very important to social psychology and their findings have many real-world applications. Basically, they brought together a group of kids and formed a class with a real teacher. They gave the kids a test for overall academic skill at the start of the course, but didn't really use the scores. Instead, they told the teachers that a few students, picked at random, were very brilliant and scores very highly. They then observed the class for a long period of time and noticed that the teachers gave the kids they thought were brilliant much more attention. At the end of the study, the kids took the test again, and they found that the kids who were randomly named brilliant at the start actually scores higher than the rest of the class. The kids, again, at the start didn't score any different from the rest of the class, but through the self-fulfilling prophecy they became the best in their class. This obviously has tons of application in the world and especially education. I've heard there is a similar process that happens in China with people born into the year of the dragon, predicted to be highly successful etc. Not entirely sure it fits into the category, but the Milgram Experiment, 13 people feigned mental illnesses to get into mental hospitals and all were admitted with different diagnoses. They then assumed their normal personalities, but to be released they all had to admit that they were mentally ill. There was a second part where a hospital challenged Milgram to send multiple fake patients to the hospital and they would rate their patients on a scale of whether they think they were faking. They identified many possible fakers, but Milgram in fact hadn't sent anyone. These are my favorite kind of studies. I love it when participants are given power and then lied to lol. The Monopoly Study. https://yahoo.be/bj8kq1wuxk close bracket by Paul Piff. He basically brought two strangers into the lab together and had them play a game of Monopoly together. He randomly assigned one participant to start the game with twice as much money than the other, and that participant also got to roll both dice to get around the board. That is, the other participant started with half the money and could only roll one dice. At the end of the game, when he asked the participants who started with more money why he won the game, they would chalk it up to their excellent strategy and gamesmanship rather than the fact that they had started the game with way more resources. It says a lot about how we deal with being born into a privileged state. I'm a huge fan of Milgram's small world experiment. It is more sociology than psychology, but I still think it is really cool. Milgram sends out 160 letters containing the name and address of a stockbroker in Boston to people in Omaha, Nebraska. They had to send it to someone they thought would get the letter closer, but they couldn't mail it directly to the stockbroker. Interestingly, most people that sent on the letter sent it on to the same group of people on the 5th degree. It only took 6 people, hence the 6 degrees of separation, to arrive, on average. It shows how interconnected our world is, even before the internet, which is happy to think about. Wow, how awesome that Milgram is famous for more than one experiment. And speaking of the internet, this is actually how packets on the internet are sent. TCP/IP. When you look up a website, the protocol doesn't know exactly how to get there. It just asks nearby computers to get you closer, until you reach the website. Amazing how fast websites load considering this imperfect medium. I loved learning about infant development. My favorite was probably the development of depth perception, or perhaps the fear of heights. We're not born with it, but, if I recall correctly, we develop it within the first year or so. Scientists created a raised square platform. Half of the floor was wood and the other glass. The actual surface of the floor, 1 meter or so below, was white with red polka dots. At varying intervals of age, the babies would be brought in and placed on the wood end and encouraged to crawl to their moms, who were standing at the glass end of the platform. In early infancy, baby crawls over there without giving a shit. At some point though, they stop at the point where the wood meets the glass, or plexiglass maybe, showing that they recognize the difference in height and the fear of falling. Babies' brains are pretty fucking cool. Deleted. Reconsolidation. When you retrieve memory from your long-term memory, it is susceptible to being manipulated. This can lead to memories being totally changed from the source. This is why eyewitness accounts cannot be fully seen as true. This knowledge is also being used to help people with PTSD by changing the negative memories they have of their particular trauma. You have been banned from Armandale effect. Mice were put on two sides of a wall with a door in. Only the right mouse could open the door. Slowly, they filled the left mouse's room with water, and eventually when right mouse saw them in danger, they opened the door. However, mice that had previously been on the left side and were now on the right, mice who had previously been wetted, opened the door considerably faster because they knew how unpleasant it was to be in the other scenario. Basically, mice have empathy. Link here, http://www.bbc.com/earth/story/20155144-rats-save-mates-from-drowning. This makes me happy. I wish more posts on this were about things like this. I want to know more. Edit. I just mean it makes me really happy to see that mice have those sorts of feelings. Too many times we are taught by the media that animals don't have those types of feelings, so it made me smile to think that a little cute mouse saved the other mouse, as if a human would. It's not that psychopaths lack empathy, but rather, they have the manual settings. A specific region of the brain lights up when people experience empathy. For most people it's an automatic, subconscious response. But in a study where they showed emotional videos to psychopaths and none while scanning their brains, psychopaths would only light that region of the brain when specifically asked to feel for the character, while the control participants would light up automatically. So, would it be possible to be some kind of benevolent psychopath, one who always or mostly chooses to empathize? The car crash experiment. It demonstrated that the way investigators would a question has an immediate effect on the subject's memory of an event. It was part of a suite of studies by Elizabeth Loftus, with various other co-researchers, that began to call into question the veracity of eyewitness accounts. https://www.simplypsychology.org/loftus-palmer.html right square bracket open bracket https://www.simplypsychology.org/loftus-palmer.html and X200B. I took a class on human memory and let me tell you, we don't remember anything very well. One time I participated in a paid research experiment. I was basically tricked into thinking I was drunk. I was placed in a room with two other people and we were instructed to drink vodka with cranberry juice over a period of time while we socialized. After we drank, I was placed in a room where I had to read some flashing words on a computer. I felt pretty drunk at this point. When the researcher came back into the room, he gave me my car keys and said I was never actually given alcohol. He briefly told me that because I was anticipating drinking for this experiment, that my brain had tricked me into feeling the effects of being intoxicated. I immediately snapped out of it and was completely amazed at how I felt. I've done this to younger siblings and relatives that won't shut up about wanting to drink shots. We just rub a bit of alcohol round the rim of the shot glass and fill it with water 3 deep, and Thiel starts snoozing on the sofa within the hour. Aaron and Dutton, 1974, misattribution of arousal. Men who had just walked across bridge, either steady or unsteady, were approached by a female psychology student, proposing to do a project on the effects of exposure to scenic attractions on creative expression. The men had to complete a questionnaire and write a short dramatic story about a picture she provided, and she gave them her phone number if they had more questions. Men who walked across the shaky bridge were more likely to call her up because they misattributed the arousal from the bridge to the woman. TLDR, watch a horror movie on the first date. Edit, grammar. Sorry about the confusion. What if I see a comedy on the first date but hire someone to mug us outside the theater? Not a psychologist, but the one where given a choice between sitting down doing nothing and shocking oneself, people tend to choose the shock. Ergo, we would choose pain over boredom. Curiosity over boredom maybe? I don't know the name of it, but apparently two people become closer if they survive through something together. Not even actual surviving death scenarios, but anything that has you on your toes and heart racing, like a roller coaster. Deleted. Dunning-Kruger effect is one of my favorites. Basically, people with less expertise in a field will overestimate their abilities in the given field because they don't know enough to see the limits of their expertise. At the same time, experts tend to underestimate their abilities because they know too well what they don't know. The phenomenon has, among other factors, been linked to anti-vaxxers, who overestimate their expertise, not seeing what they don't know, with dire consequences. Or every online game ever. Deleted. Guess I'll keep dreaming instead of achieving it, lol. The Rosenthal effect. The prejudice and expectations you have towards a student, contestant, etc. highly dictates his performance in the long run. Look it up. Pygmalion effect. I was at an educational weekend for teachers and the lecturer asked, or rather challenged, whether we want to know stuff about our students when we first start teaching them, what their strengths and weaknesses are, what we have to be careful about, etc. It broke my heart when a large number of teachers said yes. It made their job easier. I spoke up, saying it's better not to know anything except health and safety concerns because it's then easier to avoid prejudice, and some of them quite haughtily replied they are mature enough to avoid that, as if it's STH that doesn't happen subconsciously. It's sad teachers aren't taught these things while in training. If people have the upper hand, they will put others down to keep it. An experiment told a class of kids that having blue eyes meant you were smarter, achieved more, etc. All of a sudden kids with blue eyes formed their own groups. Things like bullying and exclusion of other eye colors started too. They repeated the experiment with different eye colors in different classes, all with the same results. The more interesting, terrifying thing was that halfway through, they swapped the experiment and told all of the kids that having brown eyes meant you were smarter. The flip in beliefs was immediate, as was the bullying. They tried the experiment again, giving the kids green or yellow collars, thus the difference was not even inherent. Bullying and exclusion began. Flipped the superior and inferior group, the behavior inverted. Possibly the worst part was when the children started believing that they were in fact dumber for having brown eyes or a green collar. They began to internalize the belief, and they did so quickly. Split brain studies. One example, by providing differing information to each hemisphere of the brain in split brain individuals, those with a severed corpus callosum, meaning there's no communication between the two hemispheres, they found that people would actually physically grab their own hand with their other hand if they saw it making a mistake. Basically each side of the brain controls one side of your body, and in split brain people you can actually make both sides display a disagreement with the other, which is insane, if you think about it. There's another similar experiment where people with split brains have one eye able to see a picture and the other eye can't see it. Then they draw the picture with one hand. While they're drawing the picture, if you ask them, they have no idea what the image they are being shown is. It's like they can't see it even though they can draw it. Deleted. Deleted. Whelp, the salmon study. To test a behavioral procedure in an MRI machine, the experimenters got a dead salmon to use as a dummy, as it had to be something organic. They were in shock when they discovered that the fMRI was recording increased bold response, blood oxygen level dependent, in the dead salmon when running their experiment, suggesting this dead salmon's brain was somehow reacting to the experiment. This led to the findings that fMRI is not perfect and we should expect a certain level of false positives, highlighting the importance of retests and tighter statistical analyses. I think people are missing what is the obvious case here: zombie salmon. Not quite psychology, but it very cool. Normally, if you try to mix blue light with yellow light, red and green, it turns out as white light. A scientist conducted an experiment where they would shine blue light in one eye of someone and yellow light in the other. The majority said that they just saw the light separately, but some said that they saw a new color that they couldn't even describe. This also works with cyan and red, and magenta and green. It can apparently also work if you put swatches of those two colors side by side and cross your eyes to blend the mace. Personally, I just see the two colors kind of morphing into each other blobbily if I do this. No new color. Hubel and Wissell inserted an electrode into the brain of a cat and took a single cell recording of a cell in its visual cortex. By somewhat of an accident, they found that the neuron only fired when an object had one specific orientation. This was pretty much the discovery of center surround on-off visual processing cells in the V1 visual cortex. Cool stuff. Not so much a psychology experiment, but a finding by retail researchers that if a woman is touched below the waist within the first 10 minutes of entering a store, she will leave immediately. That's why retailers who are onto this finding space their displays wide apart at the front of the store, to minimize bumping. Then they pack the merchandise tight in the back, because shoppers who've made their way back there have already been in the store 10 minutes. Wish I had a link for this. It was cited in a magazine article a decade ago. Is this why my vagisil parlor didn't do so well? Research on learned helplessness is fascinating. Researchers would put dogs into shuttle boxes, long cage-like structures that the dog could move around in, and would shock the dog through the floor on one side of the box. The dog, at first, could easily escape the shock by moving to the other side of the box. Eventually, the researcher adds a wall so the dog can't escape the shocks, it just sits there, being shocked without escape. Through this the dog learns helplessness over repeated trials and extended periods of time. Even when the wall is taken down, the dog won't walk to the other side and avoid the shocks anymore. It has become so used to the pain that it doesn't even try to escape when escape would be easy. This research has been used to explain certain aspects of human behavior, especially related to repeated experiences of abuse, addiction, and poverty. It takes a long time to get somebody out of this mindset, and is possibly one of the reasons why people get stuck in terrible situations. For everyone concerned about the dogs, this experiment was done in 1967. It's much more difficult to use animals in experiments like this, and this particular one would be considered unethical now. The case study done of Jeannie. She was a severely neglected child that never learned to speak. It became apparent that it is not possible to learn a first language as an adolescent. Edit, OP. If you're in high school, you might enjoy taking AP Psychology. I read that book. I think. Was that the situation where Noam Chomsky and the scientific community got involved and used her as a guinea pig to study language acquisition? Specifically, would someone who had never learned to speak be able to? This led to the theory that there is a window of opportunity for learning a language in the developing brain. She is still alive and lives in a community residence. Hedonic adaptation. Put simply, a person who had just won the lottery and another person who had just been paralyzed took a survey to measure their life contentment. Obviously it was high and low, respectively. However, they both took the same survey a year later and both scored similarly. The point being that regardless what happens to you in life, good or bad, you will always adapt and spend most of your life feeling neutral. Social psychologist here. The wheelchair lottery winner finding. http://sicknet.appa.org/record/1980-10001-001 close bracket was largely popularized by Dan Gilbert's 2004 TED Talk, https://www.ted.com/dan_gilbert_asks_we_happy?language end closed bracket However, that study is considered underpowered, lottery winners are rare and hard to survey, and Gilbert would later go on to state that including that study in his talk was a mistake. https://blog.ted.com/10-years-later-dan-life-after-the-dash-of-happiness/ closed bracket Hedonistic adaptation is still a thing though, and there are other good examples with stronger evidence. The rule tends to be the less ethical the experiment is, the more interesting. The Little Albert Experiment, http://en.wikipedia.org/wiki/little_albert_experiment close bracket A psychologist conditioned a baby into being scared of white, fluffy things. I also like this one very, very much. Scientists replicated 100 recent psychology experiments. More than half of them failed. http://www.scienceamag.org/content/349/AAC4716. Full close bracket. It's known that there's a huge problem with lack of replicatable results of many studies. Especially in the social sciences, economics and psychology might be the worst. Nobody wants to fund a study that's already been done, and the ones that do often turn up different results. The selective laziness of reasoning. https://onlinalibrary.wiley.com/doy/abs/10.cogs.12303 closed bracket is an article I found and then partially replicated in my research methods class during my undergraduate. It's so great with a very interesting method and results that make you think about discussions and arguments a lot. Basically, the researchers presented participants with different syllogisms, logic puzzles like all men are mortal, Socrates is a man, so Socrates is moral etc. and they asked them to provide their answers and also their reasoning for the answers. Later on, the participants were asked to return and they presented some of their old answers, but the answers were reversed to be exactly what they had written down previously, but if their own argument from prior was presented as someone else's they would disagree with it. The lesson: we critically evaluate other people's arguments with a lot more focused lens, and we afford ourselves less loopholes to jump through to substantiate our own claims. Our psych class repeated an experiment where half the class held a pencil in between their teeth, and the other half balanced on their top lips. We then rated how funny we thought a comic strip was. Turns out using face muscles associated with smiling, pencil between teeth, made the comic strip subjectively funnier than those associated with frowning, pencil balanced on top lips. Choosing to smile or frown can change how you feel and perceive life. We make snap decisions 7 seconds before we think we do. The decision is made by other parts of your brain leaving your prefrontal cortex, the part of your brain you use to think, to rationalize a decision. So you don't decide anything based on rational thought. You just try to explain your decision after it has been made. https://www.mpg.de/research/unconscious-decisions-in-the-brain. The Elevator Groupthink Study, very amusing and sad at the same time. The experiment involved several actors entering an elevator with an oblivious participant. They then begin to perform a series of odd behaviors, such as they all stood facing the rear of the elevator. Inevitably, everyone else who got on ended up also facing the rear so as not to stand out from the rest. The study demonstrates how easily people succumb to group pressure to behave in a certain way. And X200B. I feel like the reverse elevator thing is hardly a revelation. If I walked into an elevator and saw everyone apparently facing the wrong way, I would probably assume that I'm just not seeing the door and that it would somehow open on that side. A bunch of chimpanzees got trained that they get coins which they could redeem for snacks. Very quickly the guys did spend their coins on the female chimpanzees to fuck them and the girls bought snacks for it. Quite insane. Edit, Capuchin monkeys. Monkey appeared. Saw an experiment where people were subject to boredom, empty room with absolutely nothing to do, except for a small device that releases painful electric shock when pressed. People would bear a few minutes of boredom, but then they start shocking themselves because they would rather feel pain than intense boredom. Subjects were tested for introvert versus extrovert personality types. Prediction was that when placed in a sensory deprivation chamber the introverts would be able to handle it easily while the extroverts would not. Exactly the reverse was found. Introverts became agitated quickly and performed all manners of self-stimulation. Extroverts quickly went to sleep. What the finding showed was that it's introverts who are the sensation seekers, needing stimulation from the outside world. Extroverts create their own internal sensation and project that out to the world. Have you any sources for this? Seems interesting. In his book on morality, I believe, Sam Harris cites an experiment done with patients who had a corpus calloscotomy, a surgical treatment where the communicating nerves of the two hemispheres of the brain are cut in order to stop severe epileptic seizures. A sheet is placed between the eyes of a patient and on the side that isn't conscious there will be a text reading "Stand up and leave the room." The patient proceeds to stand up and walk away, at which point she is asked why they are leaving. The patient will always have an excuse or explanation ready, like they are cold and getting a sweater, or they are thirsty and going to get a drink. The real reason is, of course, that they were told. But since they don't know that, they will fabricate a story and seemingly even believe it themselves. This is a significant blow to the sense of free will and self-autonomy. Why did I choose this line of career? Why did I buy this dog? Why did I name my child this name? We think we know why we behave the way we do, but so did those patients. https://en.wikipedia.org/wiki/rat_park. Alexander's hypothesis was that drugs do not cause addiction, and that the apparent addiction to opiate drugs commonly observed in laboratory rats exposed to them is attributable to their living conditions, and not to any addictive property of the drug itself. 1. To test his hypothesis, Alexander built Rat Park, a large housing colony, 200 times the floor area of a standard laboratory cage. There were 16-20 rats of both sexes in residence, food, balls and wheels for play, and enough space for mating. 2. The results of the experiment appeared to support his hypothesis. Deleted. Hurricanes with female names are deadlier than those with male names. A paper published in PNAS by Jung et al., 2014, used 6 decades of death rates from US hurricanes and lab experiments and found that feminine named hurricanes cause significantly more deaths than do masculine named hurricanes. This is because hurricane names lead to gender-based expectations about intensity and severity, which in turn guides people's intentions to take protective action. A stunning finding on the effects of gender stereotypes. Watch out for Hurricane Irene. I'm sure she'll pass over like nothing. Hurricane Greg is on its way. Run for the fucking hills. Greg is gonna destroy us. A lot of good material for that regard in Thinking, Fast and Slow.